While watching HBO's television adaptation of The Last of Us, I was struck by a sudden realization. On one hand, it had been shaping up to be a somewhat promising adaptation of the game, but I was having a great amount of trouble waiting for it to prove to me why it needed to exist. It seems like an abstract question to ask about any piece of media, but this was fundamentally different. When a book is adapted to film, the filmmakers are taking what is essentially a series of descriptions and turning them into a visual medium. While the magic of books is truly how they unfold in your mind, everyone can agree that a good adaptation proves its worth because it's a lot less effort for a similar end goal. Instead of having to tax your brain to conjure up and remember what characters look like, what the time of day is, or how an action scene plays out, you can instead just have that information fed to you visually, allowing you to focus more on the ride. Adapting a video game to film is not the same, and if numerous failed video game adaptations are not enough to convince you of that, let me suggest some reasons as to why that may be. For one, video games ideally should have narratives that suit the gameplay, and this means aspects such as character development often fall by the wayside. This doesn't mean that they can't be done effectively, just that they usually hold a lot less importance for the main artistic goals of video games, and at worst, can even get in the way of those goals. It's a strange balance to aim for, and I get the sense that this is a huge struggle for many developers who want to add narrative depth to their games. This may be the reason that video game adaptations often fail miserably, because in order to make a game's plot work over the runtime of an average film or a television production, you have to make a lot of changes, as well as add a lot of superficial elements that will most likely just serve to piss off old-time fans and confuse new viewers. Add these things together and you're left with a recipe for mediocrity at best. But, if I may, I don't feel that this criticism alone gets to the fundamental differences of the two mediums. In a sense, film adaptations of games are reductive, because in order to be films, games are stripped of their most important and unique aspect, their interactivity. I don't think I have to explain the lengths of which this informs the divide of the two, because if I were, the rambling would go on far too long. Let's just say that games have certain strengths that could never be replicated through film and call it there. And that's the thing. I was going to call it there. That was, essentially, the furthest I'd played with the idea in my head prior to watching The Last of Us. The thing is, the adaptation is so similar to the game that it began to highlight some things to me of which I'd never considered. I know this seems like high praise, and I'm going to save the complaining for another time, but I want to preface that this has less to do with the quality of the show than it might initially seem. It's important as a critic, or as anyone who often thinks about art in an overly considered or pedantic way, to consider what biases you might have towards the medium you're most interested in. I myself am guilty of this to a great extent. I'm practically a missionary for this art form, and maybe I'd all but die to see it given the respect it deserves, but even someone as biased as me needs to admit that film does have certain inarguable strengths over games, and nowhere was this more apparent to me than a single moment from the second episode of The Last of Us. The setup is this. Protagonists Joel, Ellie, and Tess are forced to cut through a museum in the center of Boston, unaware whether its dark corridors house any flesh-eating infected humans. This example stands out to me since it plays out almost exactly as it does in the game. The set is impressively similar down to the busts of historical figures set atop glass cases or the flaking, once gaudy colonial wallpaper decorating its walls. It's a good scene and a highlight of the episode, barring any Jim Henson-esque clickers. It was here that this realization struck me. Watching our heroes slowly walk up the staircase, every step painfully creaking in the silent, decaying, and horrifically dark museum was extremely gripping. There was a heavy tension in the air as they ducked behind information tables and struggled in vain to hold their breath as to not alert the blind monsters stumbling around those same rooms, often just out of view. And when that tension finally explodes and gunfire flashes and a cacophony of violence, lighting up the room for a split second as the characters try to make sense of their surroundings. I was impressed. I was impressed that a medium in which control is taken away from the viewer was able to thrill and excite in the exact same ways as one with direct one-to-one participation was. And it was that idea of control and participation that really got me thinking. I know the narrative beats of The Last of Us very well. I knew that our three protagonists were going to make it out of the museum mostly unscathed, and yet there was still an ineffable weight to it that I hadn't felt before, even on my first playthrough of the game. I realized that, in an abstract sense, lack of control doesn't necessarily equate to a lack of participation, and that, through the rigid and ever-moving playback of film, there's a great sense of permanence that films can achieve almost effortlessly that games struggle with every time. I'll use this scene in the game as a direct comparison to illustrate my point. In the show, our three protagonists, even before coming face to face with any infected folk, are incredibly on edge. They have to move silently through the museum's halls, watch every step they take, and psych themselves up around every corner, as they don't know what will be waiting for them. The game, well, having the exact same premise and encouraging the player to take that same cautious playstyle, takes a lot of shortcuts for one reason or another. In an effort to smooth over the possibility of unfairness, the game seems somewhat afraid to ever ambush the player. Characters will often remark on their surroundings before the player has a chance to deduce that information for themselves, and encounters with infected almost always start in stealth, with the characters temporarily out of sight, giving the player enough time to work through their options and think up a plan. I want to express that this is by no means a bad thing, and in fact very tried and true game design. Even the most masochistic players would eventually tire of being ambushed with no warning, and it's good practice, especially early in the game, to give players a helping hand and guide them through areas in a way that isn't overtly patronizing. The Last of Us is a well-made game, and it understands this far better than most of its contemporaries, but it isn't immune to one fatal flaw that plagues cinematic games of its caliber: death. Say you were to find someone who'd somehow never seen or played a video game, but had seen a lot of films. Say you sat them down and had them watch an average playthrough of The Last of Us. It's safe to assume that they could follow the cutscenes and dialogue with ease and maybe even enjoy them. It's also safe to assume that as soon as the player made a mistake and got their character killed, that our guinea pig's immersion would be immediately shattered beyond repair, doubly so for repeated deaths. While this is an extreme example with a few too many assumptions, I feel that it's monumental in detailing my point. The only reason we don't question video game death anymore is that we're used to it. We know that, while it might not literally make sense, any major deaths outside of cutscenes simply don't count, or in a more conceptual sense, aren't canonical to the successful version of the story's events, and instead exist somewhere outside of that world in a parallel universe in which Joel doesn't successfully make it through the clicker-infested museum or past the high school gym bloater, and instead his journey ends with his jaw torn off and Bill as the new protagonist of the story. I understand that these are all reaches, but they're reaches that you yourself make every time you die in The Last of Us and similar games. You just don't realize you're making them. These inconsistencies have become so normal that we don't even consider them anymore, which is honestly a good thing. It means we can enjoy the thrill of games without worrying about the tiniest of mistakes.
What?
It also frees developers of the burden of creating infinite new story paths for every possible character death, which isn't only impossible, but wouldn't even necessarily be a good thing. When we sit down to play Last of Us, we want a curated story with good pacing and dramatic moments, and developers need that control over the story in order to deliver that package to its full extent. That's the appeal of games in general, a fictional environment which promises both fairness and entertainment most of the time. So, if it isn't a big deal, then why belabor the point? Well, take the museum example once again. I know what the game wants from me, and I know the role it wants me to play, but if I don't see any threats, I don't have much reason to play along other than for some intrinsic reward. If all the doors are locked and I'm looking for the next story moment, nothing is stopping me from stomping around those same staircases at a light jog, carelessly searching cabinets and cupboards and swinging my flashlight around without a care in the world like the game has trained me to do. It's only after I enter the next curated area and my character immediately ducks behind some table or other that I understand I have to be cautious. And if I fail being cautious and end up as the living dead, then I can know with certainty exactly where the game will let me retry from with such little consequence that it almost becomes a comfort. And when I keep failing and keep dying, that comfort becomes so comfortable that I start to become frustrated. I have now left the character's mindset entirely until the game figures out a way to pull me back in. There's no reason Joel would be angry at the clickers in the hallway, and there's no reason he would willingly throw himself at them over and over again to no avail because of that anger. I am no longer Joel. I am myself in possession of his body, pissed off at him when he doesn't do exactly what I tell him. This problem is exacerbated and grounded difficulty, in which a single bullet or two can end you immediately, and the encounters stray further from endure and survive, in which you live with your failures and try to work your way out of them by thinking on your toes, the way developers intended the game to be played. My grounded playthrough quickly devolved into a game of slowly waiting for enemies to be in the exact spot I needed them to be, missing with one of my revolver shots, then quitting and reloading to my most recent checkpoint, because why continue on after a mistake like that? This trial and error playstyle the game had forced me into, in which I willingly removed myself from the immersion in order to nudge the game 1 degree in my favor just to make it to the next encounter, was not only a Sisyphean task, but also so far removed from the intended experience that it became utterly absurd. It's this artificiality that interests me because I know, in theory, what the game was aiming for. I understand that Naughty Dog had the extremely difficult task of choosing when to add gaminess and when to emulate films. I just think that these mechanics, and to a broader extent the themes the game is trying to push, only work to a certain magnitude, and begin to crack under the pressure of their own aspirations. Herein lies another strike against the issue of death in video games. Many games that intend to suck you in through harsh and unforgiving conditions only end up antithetical in the end, when frustration becomes the only emotion left. With all that laid out, we can finally ask the question, why death? The concept of controlling a character, barring tabletop RPGs, was not immediately apparent to developers as the first video games began to release. What was apparent, however, was the inherent challenge that games needed to exist. After all, they were games, inventions in the same vein as chess or baseball, and the appeal lay predominantly in struggle. Struggle against an opponent and ultimately some kind of success or failure. In this, we have a fundamental idea. Games cannot exist without challenges, as victory cannot exist without some failure state. While Pong may not be the true first video game, it illustrates my point well. As a direct, virtual adaptation of table tennis, it was immediately apparent to players what the victory condition was. Let the ball slip past your paddle and your opponent scores a point. Get it past theirs and vice versa. There was little to philosophize here, but as games became more sophisticated, the line between controlling a character and being that character began to blur. Humans naturally emphasize with living beings, human or otherwise, so once players were in control of Mario, for instance, developers had to come up with new failure states to contextualize failure and further immersion, and the most universal choice was death. While Mario may not physically die when he falls down a pit, his retries are contextualized as lives, which leads us to the conclusion that, upon running out, Mario is dead. He never defeats Bowser, and he never rescues the princess. While it might seem macabre when I put it that way, I want to stress that the game doesn't ever dwell on it, and putting so much thought towards Mario's untimely demise was never the point. Super Mario takes place in a fantasy land full of vicious mushrooms and turtles that walk upright, so it's safe to say that the game asks you to take a pretty big leap of your suspension of disbelief right on the face of it. I'm not trying to say that the game needed anything else. In a way, Mario's death is an important part of the experience. It's immediately obvious what the stakes are, as cartoonish as they may be, and it allows players to step into Mario's shoes if only a tiny bit more. Identifying with Mario, whether emotionally, kinesthetically, or otherwise, does benefit from those stakes, and I would be lying if I said it didn't add to the thrill of it all. It didn't take long for character death to become the default failure state most associated with video games, and for a large percentage of the medium, I think it works pretty well. It's a good thing that you can boot a game up, see a health bar, and immediately know what the stakes are for your character. That abstraction is important, and I hold a pretty firm belief that games should show and not tell, so it would only complicate things further to have to contextualize failure in increasingly nuanced ways. Most games can only stand to benefit from death being default, and that's okay. It's a pillar of the medium, and it likely isn't going anywhere soon, but you can see why this default has begun to hurt games that take their subject matter very seriously. While Super Mario and The Last of Us may share some service-level similarities, such as the constant looming threat of a mushroom that can obliterate you and all those you love in an instant, it doesn't take a trained eye to see that both games have a very different goal in how they aim to immerse you in their worlds. The grounded presentation of The Last of Us is not only its greatest gameplay ambition, but also has a big role to play in its marketing. In a sense, The Last of Us needs death as a failure state to achieve this goal. If there wasn't a way to die, or if Joel could shrug off bullets like the Terminator, then the immersion would be shattered. It's clear why Naughty Dog opted for the system they have: a brief and disturbing death animation, a quick cut to black, then back to your last checkpoint. It's quick, clean, and with our learned understanding to ignore deaths when it's our fault, we don't have to dwell on it. You may have died, but your character didn't, or at least not this version of them. Check it out. There they are, no worse for wear. It's tempting to say that The Last of Us simply wouldn't work without this caveat, and I'd be inclined to agree with you, but only on the basis that the game, as it exists right now, would be unrecognizable without it. I respect The Last of Us quite a bit. It has interesting and unique gameplay for being a AAA stealth third-person shooter, and it has unparalleled cinematic presentation even 10 years after its release. It's safe to say it's a pretty great game, even without some new, innovative idea of how to handle failure, but I would hope that by now you can see the appeal. While an easy fix for The Last of Us immersion-breaking issues might be unattainable, it's important to mention that games have pulled this off before, in a few different ways. While the Souls games get a lot of praise for their level design and great sense of player agency, an often overlooked aspect of which I really like is how death is contextualized. In most of these games, your character will have some in-universe explanation for why they, or other creatures, are allowed to come back from the dead, whether that be a curse or a parallel plane of existence, etc. What initially seems like dark fantasy set dressing actually goes a long way towards solidifying immersion, because there's no question as to what's a canonical death and what isn't. It also serves to draw you even closer to your virtual avatar. If you got them killed during an ambush you didn't see coming, then it stands to reason that the both of you would remember to be a little more careful next time. The knowledge and wherewithal needed to fight your way through what seemed impossible half an hour ago is all the sweeter when you feel this kinship with your player character. In The Last of Us, if Joel was killed by an ambush on his previous life, then somewhat of a metaphorical stake is driven through the two of you, because now you have information he doesn't. Now, instead of occupying the same space of mind, you have to play Joel as if you were a puppeteer, and either try to balance acting surprise while knowing what's coming, or just throw it out the window, because at the end of the day it doesn't matter. You aren't Joel, and you never were. Though it might be unfair to compare such different games on the same metric, I believe it's detrimental to the medium as a whole to keep ignoring the issues that non-canonical death can raise when it comes to immersion. Sometimes, what's safest and most convenient for a game's moment-to-moment needs can actually be harmful to its greater purpose or deeper themes. It's the reason why games regarded as classics are usually ones that take great risks and inspire some kind of butterfly effect throughout the industry, changing the medium for the better. This is precisely the reason why I like to think that these issues are growing pains rather than inherent faults of the medium. I'm hopeful that, in time, developers will straighten out what games need to feel as unbroken as films feel, and smooth over the issue of sweeping failure under the rug by playing to their inherent strengths as interactive pieces of art. Maybe we're only moments away from a spiritual breakthrough in which games start using Buddhist themes to justify reincarnation, and The Last of Us Part 3 follows the tale of a monk who learns to live in harmony with the parasitic fungi, instead of blowing their heads off with a shotgun if they deign to come within his personal space. Maybe not a people pleaser, but if you remember the fiasco a few years back, the second game wasn't really either.